Jack, when Trump initially came out with tariffs on Canada, you said Canada, don't worry. Well, we're presently worrying. Would you mind giving us an update on what's happening with Trump and tariffs, please?
Yeah, I originally believed that Trump's actions were a negotiating ploy. Now I'm wondering if I were wrong, and he's actually going through with the tariffs. It's hard to tell because I'm in Detroit, and Detroit, of course, is very automotive oriented. So the automotive industry is very concerned about, are these tariffs temporary? Are they going to be uh, what level they're going to be at? How high will they be? How low will they be? How long will they be? And because you can't plan manufacturing budgets on, well, maybe this will happen, maybe that'll happen. You have to take risk into account and probabilities. So the GM earnings report came out a couple of days ago, and I noticed in there, they had mentioned that the tariffs will be a cost. They assume there'll be a cost, and that cost will be a charge against earnings in the next for the next period. So, in other words, they've taken this into account. But what's interesting to me is the same earnings report also highlights that General Motors has 80 facilities in the United States assembling cars and making components, and all of them are going to be brought back into operation as GM resumes its focus on manufacturing in the United States. Now, they don't say they're not going to do anything in Canada. They just don't mention Canada. They talk about what they're going to do in the United States. And what's interesting about that is that this is logical, but I don't know how you use logic when you're dealing with President Trump, because you never know from one minute to the next what he's going to do. And the problem is these changes of mind that he has are enormously expensive. So, for example, General Motors has to predict that they may take a charge against earnings. They have to say, well, we're going to make all of our stuff in the United States, therefore we won't be worrying about tariffs. But at the same time, they don't say they're not going to manufacture in Canada. And as I've said before, changing the location of a factory means not just packing up and moving from St. Thomas, Ontario, let's say, to Flint, Michigan. It means changing supply chains, changing vendors, sources. It's enormously complicated and expensive. And you can't start and stop these things on a dime. So I think, in my opinion, President Trump is not doing anybody favors by these attitudes. Okay. So I'm concerned that all of this is going to cost America and Canada a lot of money. And I don't know that it's going to achieve anything. As Shakespeare said, a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. But maybe it signifies losses. And I don't understand why this is going on. So, mea culpa, I was wrong about whether or not the Canada would be affected, because Canada is America's closest ally, best friend, and biggest supplier of serious manufactured goods. When I say serious, I mean manufacturing a car is quite different from manufacturing a children's toy. And we're pretty good in North America at manufacturing cars. But we can't do it competitively and economically, even for our own use, unless we know we have clear instructions from our governments on what the taxes are going to be. And make no mistake, tariffs are just a tax.
I'm so happy that you brought up reviewing the General Motors report this morning, Jack. Yesterday, I was watching the Meet the Press interview with Donald Trump, President Trump, and in it, he said, we don't want the Canadian cars. I don't know if you saw that. Did you see that? He says, we don't want the Canadian, we don't need your Canadian cars. So would you like to comment on that? Because it's my understanding that the Canadian cars that we're creating are actually the American cars. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Okay, I'm agreeing with you, Tracy. I don't understand the adjective. Those are American cars. They're manufactured in Canada. Okay, so what he's basically saying is we don't want American cars. I mean, if he could hear himself, he might, we say that people like him begin speaking before they put their brain in gear. Okay, and I'm wondering. I can't, I'm in no position to criticize him. Okay, but I'm going to criticize him. I think that he's not taking into account how important it is not to disrupt existing supply chains in North America. They're there for a reason. The border between the United States and Canada is either a pencil line in South Dakota or a mile-wide river in Michigan. And it's not a barrier. We have bigger barriers in the country. It's harder to cross the Mississippi than it is the Detroit River. So we need to stop all of this and realize that we are one group in North America. And this idea of saying, okay, I understand Canadian sovereignty and American sovereignty, but we're basically the same people. We have the same thoughts and ideas. And the people who distributed the supply chains for manufacturing never dreamed anything like this would happen. Didn't President Trump in his first term negotiate a treaty between Canada, the United States, and Mexico to eliminate any problem like this? And after that treaty, which he negotiated, all of our manufacturing companies assumed the continent was one market. The continent is one market. Drawing these lines is a big mistake, and it'll cost a lot of money, and it'll lower the standard of living in all three countries. I'm adding Mexico. Okay, I don't agree with this. I don't know what's going on. I hope it's a expensive negotiating ploy and that it'll pass. But I noticed one last thing. The Canadian people seem to be not in tune with President Trump because they've elected now a new prime minister from the same party as the previous prime minister. We were told in the United States that not only was the previous prime minister a bad guy from our point of view, but his party was bereft of ideas. Well, I guess the Canadian people don't agree with that. So we have to accept in America that Canadians haven't changed at all. It's us. We've changed, and I don't understand why.
Okay, so Jack, thank you. I have the quote here. He said, we don't need their cars. We don't need their lumber. We don't need their energy. We don't need anything. They need us. We don't need them. So with that, if you can just back up, I don't think, not everybody who is in the, not in the critical mineral sector may understand really the partnerships that we've developed over the years between Detroit and Ontario, for instance, in building cars. Can you give some background on some of the manufacturers that are actually working or used to work closely with Canada?
Well, yeah, sure. You have, when I was an automotive supplier, I would go to St. Thomas, Ontario, or to Mississauga, or to Montreal, the area, and there were General Motors plants, Ford plants, all of the Chrysler minivans, which were the biggest selling car that Chrysler ever had, were made in Windsor, and that was a large factory. And I can't even. There must have been in the 1980s at least a dozen assembly plants in Canada, automotive assembly plants, owned and operated by American companies. My wife's principal at the school where she taught, her husband was the the chairman of GM Canada, and we would visit him in Toronto, and her, and his wife, and we'd see them, and I never saw any difference between Canada and the United States. I mean, I understood that legally there had to be GM Canada for tax purposes, obviously, but none of us in the supplier community or automotive ever dreamed of thinking about two countries. It was just two locations in the same place, okay, in the same market. And so what I'm seeing here is confusion, and confusion is expensive. And people have to make plans, and they're gonna have to spend money, and if it's for no reason, that's wasted money, and it's less earnings, okay? And what about the jobs? If General Motors says, well, we're going to make our cars in the United States. What about the people who work in Montreal or in any GM assembly plant in Canada, or parts plant, or raw material or processing sourcing plant? Okay, the idea that we don't need Canada, I guess you could restate that by saying we can pay more for things, because America, the United States doesn't source from other countries for fun. It's to lower cost, and it lowers costs in both countries. Okay. And so if we're going to decide not to source from Canada or Mexico, it means prices are going to go up in the United States. And I'll tell you what the US government, the last thing I'm going to say, doesn't understand. There are other markets in the world besides the United States. And if you force the issue, my guess is that Canada is going to get much closer to Europe and maybe even South America as a market. Canada is a huge resource of not only natural resources, but manufacturing skills and goods that other countries don't have. Or Canada, compared to, let's say, Germany, is a wonderfully lower cost place. Okay, Koreans make cars in Canada. Germans make cars in Canada. There's a reason for that. Okay, and if the United States says, okay, we're not going to buy, we're going to make it so expensive that our companies come home and make their cars in the United States. Guess what? Canadians will still make cars. It's just that they'll go to other markets. Period. So we have to be careful here not to let this continue, because it might make a sea change that we won't appreciate in the United States.
Well, Jack, as always, it's a real pleasure, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week at the CMI Summit 4. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.